Hey friends, welcome to Unpolished by Called. I'm Kathrin Shaffer. So there's a funny thing that happens once we start taking faith seriously. At some point we realize that believing in Jesus and actually following him are not always the same experience. Belief can live comfortably in our minds for quite a while. We can understand the story, agree with the teachings, even feel deeply moved by them. But discipleship, the actual following part, has a way of moving from ideas into the middle of our everyday decisions. And that's where things get a little less tidy. Because when we hear the word discipleship, our minds often drift towards something that looks impressive. We imagine someone spiritually disciplined, someone who seems calm and wise and always has a thoughtful answer ready, whose life appears neatly ordered around prayer, scripture, and purposeful living. The picture in our minds is polished, organized, almost cinematic. But when we look honestly at how following Jesus actually unfolds in real life, the picture looks a lot more ordinary than that. Most of the time, discipleship doesn't feel impressive. It feels inconvenient. It shows up in moments that interrupt our normal instincts. Moments when we would rather say one thing, but realize we probably shouldn't. Moments when we would prefer to hold on to our pride, but know humility would be the better path. When love is not the easiest option on the table. And those moments rarely arrive with dramatic music playing in the background. They show up quietly in the middle of a regular day. So following Jesus has always been like that. When Jesus first called people to follow him, he didn't hand them a program or a checklist that made them look spiritually accomplished overnight. He invited them into a life where they would slowly learn to see the world differently. They would learn to respond differently, live differently. But that learning happened while they were living ordinary lives. They walked dusty roads, ate meals together, argued sometimes, misunderstood things. They asked questions that probably sounded a little naive. They were figuring it out as they went. And that's an important detail we sometimes overlook. Discipleship wasn't designed to make people look impressive. It was designed to make them faithful. Faithfulness rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It doesn't always attract attention. Most of the time, it unfolds quietly inside choices that other people might never notice. Which means, if we're waiting for discipleship to feel impressive before we think we're doing it right, we might miss the places where it's already happening. Because the real question isn't whether our faith looks impressive. The real question is whether it's shaping the way we actually live. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Not the polished idea of discipleship, but the real life version. The version that shows up in conversations, reactions, relationships, and decisions that nobody else sees. That quietly asks us day by day whether we're willing to follow Jesus, even when it feels ordinary. So let's get into it. One of the most interesting tensions in modern Christianity is that we have access to more information about faith than any generation before us. And yet, discipleship can still feel strangely abstract. You can listen to sermons, read books, study theology, follow conversations about scripture online, absorb a tremendous amount of insight about what Jesus taught. In many ways, That's a gift. The ability to learn, reflect, and grow in understanding is something believers throughout history would have treasured. But there's a subtle shift that can happen when faith becomes mostly informational. We start to measure spiritual growth by how much we know rather than by how we live. We can explain ideas about forgiveness while still holding on to resentment. We can articulate the importance of humility while quietly protecting our own pride. We can discuss the concept of loving our neighbors while still avoiding people who make us uncomfortable. None of this happens because we're intentionally trying to be inconsistent. It happens because knowing something and practicing it are two very different experiences. Jesus seemed keenly aware of that difference. When he invited people to follow him, he didn't frame discipleship primarily as learning information. Of course, there was teaching. There were conversations, parables, explanations. But the invitation, sorry, my dogs, but the invitation was always relational and active. Follow me. Not just listen to me or agree with me. Follow. And following implies movement. It implies imitation. Allowing someone's way of living to shape the way we move through our own lives. And that's where discipleship becomes less theoretical and more personal. Because once we begin asking how the teachings of Jesus actually intersect with our daily decisions, things get interesting. Suddenly, the conversation moves out of abstract ideas and into real life. What does loving our enemies look like when someone genuinely frustrates us? What does humility look like when we're convinced we're right about something? What does generosity look like when we're tempted to hold tightly to what we have? These questions don't always have neat answers, because life itself isn't neat. But discipleship begins when we start wrestling with them honestly. It's also where we begin to realize that following Jesus often challenges our own natural instincts. Many of the things he taught run directly against the grain of how we normally respond to situations. Our default reactions are shaped by self-protection, pride, the desire to appear competent and respected. Jesus consistently invited people into a different posture, one marked by humility, compassion, patience, and sacrificial love. That kind of posture doesn't develop overnight. It develops through practice. And practice means we're going to get it wrong sometimes. The disciples themselves certainly did. There are moments in the Gospels where they misunderstood Jesus completely. Moments where they argue about status or recognition, where fear overrides their trust. But Jesus didn't dismiss them because they were still learning. He continued walking with them, teaching, correcting, helping them see things from a new perspective. Their discipleship wasn't measured by how quickly they mastered everything. It was measured by their willingness to keep following. And that same dynamic continues in our own lives. Following Jesus doesn't mean we suddenly become flawless examples of spiritual maturity. It means we're learning, slowly and sometimes awkwardly, to let his way of living shape ours. Sometimes that learning happens in small but meaningful moments. A conversation where we choose kindness instead of sarcasm. A situation where we admit we were wrong instead of defending ourselves. A moment where we pause long enough to ask what love would look like before reacting. Those moments don't feel impressive, but they are where discipleship lives. Another thing we begin to notice is that following Jesus often disrupts our expectations about what matters most. Our culture tends to reward visibility and recognition. We celebrate the people who appear confident, accomplished, influential. But Jesus consistently redirected attention toward qualities that don't always attract applause. Humility, servanthood, faithfulness in small things. When he spoke about greatness, it often sounded upside down compared to the values we're used to. The first will be last. The greatest will be the servant. Love your enemies. Pray for those who mistreat you. Those teachings aren't abstract ideas meant to sit comfortably on a page. They're invitations to live differently. And living differently rarely looks impressive in the conventional sense. It looks like quiet integrity. It looks like choosing patience when impatience would be easier. It looks like extending grace in situations where retaliation might feel more satisfying. And because those choices happen privately so often, they can feel invisible. We might wonder if they matter, but discipleship has always been built out of these quiet decisions. Over time, those decisions shape our character. They gradually influence how we think and respond. We start noticing subtle shifts in the way we approach situations. The things that once triggered immediate frustration may begin to provoke a more thoughtful response. The need to defend our image may now slowly lose some of its urgency. These shifts rarely happen dramatically. They happen through repetition. Countless ordinary moments where we're given the opportunity to practice what Jesus taught. Which brings us back to the central idea. Discipleship is not about appearing impressive. It's about becoming faithful. And faithfulness tends to grow quietly. It grows when we allow the teachings of Jesus to move beyond ideas and into the way we treat people. When we let humility interrupt our pride and compassion interrupt our impatience. It grows when we choose integrity in moments where shortcuts would be easy. Those choices might not look like spiritual milestones from the outside, but they represent something deeply significant. They represent a life that is gradually being shaped by the way of Jesus. And that shaping happens right in the middle of ordinary life, where following him moves from something we believe into something we practice. Once we start realizing that discipleship is about following Jesus in real life, rather than just agreeing with him in theory, something becomes clear fairly quickly. Following Jesus doesn't mostly happen in the moments we expect. It doesn't usually show up in the places where faith feels the most visible. It shows up in the quiet spaces of everyday life, where our instincts are tested and our character is revealed. That's the part that makes discipleship feel so ordinary. It doesn't wait for perfect conditions. It unfolds in the middle of real conversations, frustrations, decisions. It meets us in the moments where our first reaction might be impatience defensiveness, pride, indifference, and then quietly asks whether we're willing to respond differently. And if we're honest, those moments arrive constantly. Constantly. Discipleship shows up when someone says something that rubs us the wrong way, and we feel that immediate urge to react. We all know that feeling. The quick internal response that wants to correct them, push back, or defend ourselves. In that moment, it becomes very clear that following Jesus isn't just about believing certain truths. It's about learning how to carry ourselves differently when our emotions are stirred. Jesus talked often about love, but the kind of love he described was rarely convenient. Loving people in theory is easy. Loving people when they frustrate us, misunderstand us, or disappoint us is something else entirely. And yet, that is exactly where discipleship begins to take shape. Not when love feels natural, but when we decide to practice it even when our instincts pull in another direction. Another place discipleship shows up is in our words. It's easy to overlook how much power our words carry in shaping the atmosphere around us. A conversation can move towards understanding or towards tension depending on how we respond. Sometimes discipleship simply looks like choosing restraint, choosing not to escalate a situation, to speak honestly but with kindness rather than letting irritation dictate the tone of our response. Those choices may seem small in the moment, but over time they shape the culture of our relationships. They influence whether people experience us as someone who brings calm or someone who adds pressure to a situation. And when we begin to see those moments through the lens of discipleship, we realize they are opportunities to live out what Jesus taught in ways that are deeply practical. Discipleship also shows up in integrity. Integrity is one of those qualities that often goes unnoticed because it usually reveals itself in situations where no one else is paying attention. It's the choice to do the right thing when it would be easier to cut a corner. The quiet decision to be truthful when exaggerating would make us look better. It's the willingness to follow through on commitments, even when keeping them becomes inconvenient. Those moments rarely draw recognition. No one applauds integrity when it happens privately. But those choices matter deeply because they shape who we are when no one else is watching. And discipleship has always been about character before reputation. Jesus consistently emphasized the condition of the heart over the appearance of outward performance. We begin to see that same pattern in the way discipleship influences our relationships. Relationships are often the places where our spiritual life becomes most visible because relationships reveal how we handle conflict, disappointment, and differences in perspective. It's one thing to speak about forgiveness as an idea. It's another thing to practice forgiveness when someone has genuinely hurt us. Forgiveness can feel particularly difficult because it doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't pretend the hurt wasn't real. But choosing forgiveness means we refuse to let resentment become the defining force in the relationship. And that choice can take time. It can involve prayer, reflection, and sometimes repeated decisions to release anger rather than nurture it. And yet, that process is exactly where discipleship unfolds. Jesus spoke often about forgiveness, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary for a life shaped by grace. When we begin to practice forgiveness, we're not just resolving a conflict, we're allowing the mercy we've received from God to influence how we respond to others. Discipleship also challenges the way we approach humility. Humility is often misunderstood as weakness, but in reality, it requires tremendous strength. It asks us to release the constant need to prove ourselves. It invites us to listen instead of always needing to speak. It allows us to admit when we've been wrong without feeling like our worth is at stake. Practicing humility can feel uncomfortable at first because pride is deeply woven into the way many of us have learned to navigate life. We're used to protecting our image, defending our perspective, making sure others see us in the best possible light. But when we follow Jesus, that instinct begins to shift. We start realizing that being right is not always the most important thing. Being loving, patient, and honest often matters more. That shift changes the tone of our interactions with people. Instead of approaching conversations as competitions, where we need to win the argument, we begin approaching them with curiosity and respect. We start valuing understanding over dominance, and that kind of humility quietly transforms the environment around us. Another place discipleship appears is in the way we handle responsibility. Faithfulness in responsibility doesn't always feel spiritual, but it reflects the kind of character Jesus consistently honored. Being dependable, following through, doing our work with honesty and care rather than cutting corners or looking for shortcuts. It's easy to separate our spiritual life from our practical responsibilities, but discipleship brings those areas together. The way we work, the way we manage our commitments, treat people in ordinary interactions, all of those things become expressions of the values we're learning from Jesus. As these patterns begin to take root, something interesting happens. The changes in our lives may still look fairly ordinary from the outside, but internally we start noticing a different rhythm. We begin to pause more often before reacting. Consider how our choices affect others. We become more aware of the quiet guidance of the Holy Spirit, nudging us towards patience, honesty, or compassion in situations where our instincts once moved in another direction. None of this makes life suddenly perfect. We still have moments where we react poorly or realize later that we handled something the wrong way. Discipleship does not eliminate human weakness, but it does create a willingness to keep learning. Instead of pretending we always get it right, we begin to approach those moments with humility, asking God to continue shaping us. And over time, that willingness becomes one of the clear signs of a life being formed by faith. Not perfection, but openness to growth. Not impressive spiritual performance, but steady responsiveness to the way Jesus calls us to live. The more we walk this path, the more we see that discipleship isn't about curating a spiritual image for others to admire. It's about allowing the teachings of Jesus to influence the way we treat people, the way we make decisions, carry ourselves through ordinary life. It looks like patience practiced in difficult conversations, integrity practiced when no one else is watching, forgiveness in relationships that have been strained, humility when pride would feel easier. And those practices may never make our lives look impressive in the eyes of the world, but they shape something far more important. They shape our character. They shape the way people experience us. And they quietly reflect the influence of the one we're learning to follow. So discipleship, in the end, is not about appearing spiritual. It's about becoming faithful in the middle of real life. If there's one thing worth remembering from this conversation, it's that discipleship doesn't have to look impressive to be real. Following Jesus rarely unfolds in dramatic moments that everyone can see. Most of the time, it shows up in the quiet decisions that shape how we treat people, how we handle conflict, and how we respond when life tests our character. And it will. Those moments may feel ordinary, but they are exactly where a life of faith takes shape. Each decision to practice patience, integrity, humility, or forgiveness becomes part of the process of being formed over time. So, if your life doesn't feel especially impressive or polished right now, that doesn't mean discipleship isn't happening. In many ways, it means you're right in the middle of it. The everyday places where we live, work, speak, and interact with people are the places where following Jesus becomes real. If you want to explore more conversations like this, or find the resources connected to the show, everything lives in the show notes. That's where the Start Here guide is, along with the other pieces of the ecosystem that connects to this podcast and the wider work we're doing here and together. So thank you for being part of this conversation today. And wherever your week takes you, remember that following Jesus often looks simple, steady, and faithful in the middle of ordinary life. And that kind of discipleship matters more than we realize. Thanks for sitting in this conversation with me, and we'll talk again soon.